Today we're going to be looking at how we might plan for a character question for an inspector calls. If you are asked about a character, generally speaking, you're asked how are they presented, how are they shown in a particular way, either to sympathize with them or dislike them. So there are potentially about 10 or 11 possible ways that you could do this. You need to consider, first of all, how they are presented early in the play. It's very important to recognize that there is a particular presentation that places them at the, if you like, happy, entitled, unaware stage of their life before they are exposed to reality. Another way to look at their presentation is how they are shown after the entrance of the inspector. You need to consider what impact the inspector has on the character you are looking at, when he begins to have that impact with them, and what it is that he either says or does, how that character responds either in dialogue or in movement. So take Sheila, for instance. She runs out of the room once she's shown the photograph by the inspector. She runs out tearfully, but she returns. But she returns a stronger character, which is the interesting thing. She left a weak woman and returned a stronger and far more empowered person as the play progressed. Another way to look at character is how they are shown at the end of the play. Consider what has occurred. It has been one sitting, one consecutive run of events and interaction within that area. And by the end of the play, they have traversed a gamut of emotion and beliefs and recriminations. But how do they end the play? Do they return and do full circle back to how they were at the beginning? Or do they forge forward as a different personality? How do they respond to other characters? So this is quite important. Their interaction with each other is something you could look at and explore. The character that you're focusing on, how are they influenced by the characters around them? Remember, an example would be Eric and Gerald. These are two young men, a few years apart, not many. And if you look at the manner of their behavior, you begin to recognize a similarity, a pattern, and we'll talk about that shortly. So consider how one might have, the elder, Gerald, may well have influenced Eric in what he did and how he did it. Another way to consider the characters is how they are used by Priestley to represent sections of society. Remember, this play is a microcosm of society, and so each character is symbolic almost of a group of people in society, whether those are influential people, people without voice, people who are changing and becoming more vocal. Consider also how the author creates sympathy for these characters. What is it that they may say? How is it that they are treated that causes an audience to look sympathetically, to consider developing a certain loyalty over the course of the play towards a particular character? And in the same way, how does the author create a potential dislike? What you will find with each character in the play is that whilst the audience might sympathize with a character, the audience will at times dislike quite intensely their behavior, attitudes, or actions. How does the author show a separation between the character you're looking at and the different classes? Through their behavior potentially, or what they have said, through comments that we might consider a throwaway comment, a dismissive comment, but which indicates a dismissive view of a particular class. Think also how the author shows the contrast between their moral behavior or moral outlook and the hard-working lower class. How does the author use them to portray the reversal of what people perceived classes to be like then and at the setting of the play and at the presentation of the play when it was performed? What you must consider when you are writing about character is not just, can I find evidence? Can I use that evidence and explain it so that we can see what this character meant when they were talking? That's great. But actually, you need to be able to show through that explanation, can we see how Priestley wants us to recognize what they are like? How Priestley is trying to show them. Too often students don't realize that they have missed that they haven't indicated, and so this person is presented in this way or as this. So I'm just going to run through a quick list of the characters and the way in which Priestley presents them with one or two particular lines of evidence or nuggets of evidence that you might use. Mr. Berlin is presented by Priestley as coarse, rough, unfair. He's presented as unrepentant and smug. Towards the end of the play, he says to them, you'll have a good laugh over it, suggesting that in the morning they'll be quite tickled and quite amused by the events of the evening. And he feels confident in himself that he'll be laughing at what almost could have been. Hence the idea that Priestley shows him in this rather smug way. But at the beginning of the play, he's shown as quite impervious to the reality of the situation. So he says to the inspector, a nasty mess you've made of it, it being the pleasant evening that they were having. Not realizing, and the inspector does actually bring him to task on this immediately afterwards, with saying that's what he was thinking when he looked at Eva, that she was had a promising life, and a nasty mess somebody has made of that. Berlin pauses for a moment, but not enough to show that that has registered with him, and leaves the room. Mrs. Berlin is presented as someone who is entitled, feels as if she's owed something. She's presented as ruthless, vindictive, hypocritical, unfair, and prejudiced. That entitlement is revealed in almost her first interaction with the inspector, when she says, when on first meeting him, I'm Mrs. Berling, you know. Now, if we look structurally at what Priestley has done here, he has ended her comment to the inspector with, you know. There is an expectation from Mrs. Berlin that he is fully aware of the magnitude of her position and who he is speaking to. And so captured in this is a multitude of information. In that phrase, you know, there is the idea that we are very important people, be careful what you say, and there could be consequences. Sheila is presented as vain, impulsive, rash, shallow, determined, canny. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with that word, but canny is somebody who is quite smart but quick. That cleverness is something that picks up on what's going on around them quite quickly. She's also shown as aware and very astute. Now, where she's shown as shallow is early on in the play, where on hearing of the demise and the terrible way that Eva Smith died, she asks very quickly, was she pretty? Which begs the question, had she not been, would she have deserved to die that particular way? It is almost as if the aesthetic outer appearance is important in signifying somebody's worth or somebody's value. Thankfully, this changes very quickly into the play, and she finishes the play a stronger individual. Gerald is an interesting character. He's shown very early as suave, but also deceptive. At the end of Act 1, he pleads with Sheila not to let the inspector know that he has knowledge of Daisy Renton. What's interesting is, and what most students miss, is that he's also shown as predatory, as a predator. So we think about what, in his recollection and recount of what happened and how he met Eva Smith, one of the first things he says is that when she looked over after being accosted by McGarty, she looked over with nothing less than a cry for help. He recognized her vulnerability and so swooped in, took her to somewhere where, in his words, he knew it would be quiet. Now we need to interpret that really carefully. Knowing it would be quiet suggested not just that there would be fewer people present, less people to see him with her, but very few people to save her from him. So that predatory nature of his was very apparent throughout his recollection of his dalliance with Daisy Renton. Eric begins the play being shown as rather, as the scene direction said, half shy, half assertive. Now that seems quite an oxymoron, because to be shy would suggest he is hesitant, but assertive would suggest a confidence. And what we discover much later in the play, when indeed he is spoken to by the inspector, is that he is in fact, or was irresponsible, entitled, rough, criminal in his behavior. And thankfully, within a short space of time, he experiences quite a magnitude of change. He becomes quite bold in asserting himself with his father. His honesty surfaces, and he, like Sheila, becomes quite aware. However, there are parts of Eric that do make us dislike him. So, in talking about his rough behavior with Eva, he euphemizes his actions and says of himself, he was at that point when a chap easily turns nasty. A chap almost downplays the thuggish behavior that he alludes to. He's also shown as dishonest. When Mr. Berlin says he stole the money, he says, no, not really. And then he suffixes that by saying, I was going to pay it back. Whether he was going to pay it back or not, he still stole the money. Now, this idea of not being accountable, accepting responsibility, being dishonest, remember I talked about compare and contrast and look at influence. Where is Eric being influenced in all of this? Who has that same, if you like, distance from accountability? But his father, of course. If we also look at his behavior towards Eva and the women at the establishment, he notes she wasn't the usual sort. Now, language like that we hear earlier on in the play, girls of that type. And where do we hear that from? His mother. So in a sense, whilst we dislike the behavior we see from Eric, we recognize also instantly that this is learnt behavior. This is something that he has watched and has become habitual for him. I think finally with Eric, it's important for us to recognize that he is used to counter the idea that the poor or the lower class were the criminal ones, because his whole behavior throws this idea completely in the air. And the inspector in questioning him, early in his interrogation, asks him, was she, Eva, drunk too? There is no question that Eric was drunk, irresponsible, and not acting in the way a gentleman was expected to behave, the values they were meant to uphold. But the response to that at first would suggest that she was a little like him. He says she was a bit. And at that point, you're thinking, well, it seems she was on the road. But then we recognize that it was because the little drink she had had reacted quite quickly with her because she had not had much to eat. And we become instantly aware, here is Eva Smith, vulnerable again, placed in harm's way, and he recognizing, remembering enough that she hadn't eaten, that she was a little tipsy through really no fault of her own, like Gerald, takes advantage of her vulnerability. So like-minded individuals, people who also behave in the same way, tend to rub off on each other, and that behavior is evident in not just Eric, with Eric and Gerald, but also with Eric and his parents. So the last thing I suppose we need to talk about is think about the inspector who we haven't mentioned, and think about how the inspector is revealed as everything they are not. So imagine all the words that I have used to show how each of these characters are presented. Priestley presents the inspector as directly opposite to that. He shows the inspector as fair, firm. He shows the inspector as honest, able to discern in a way that the parents, for instance, were unable to discern about Eric's behavior and also Eric's alcohol problems. So I hope this has been useful. I will put together another video on how you might plan for themes. Thank you.